Brad?
Thank you, Ambassador Lyman. Thanks to the U.S. Institute of Peace for the opportunity to be on this distinguished panel and in a distinguished audience. If I may, Ambassador, I want to two slight amendments to your introduction. I was the special advisor for conflict diamonds at the State Department. That modification is, it was already big enough, but at least that modifies it to a little bit.
Kimberly process.
Exactly,
Okay.
the Kimberly process.
Sorry.
No, that's okay. I used to glibly refer to myself at times as the special advisor for people fighting over rocks when I was at the State Department, which is not to diminish the impact of the conflict, but at least to narrow the types of conflicts I worked on. In addition to being the policy director of Enough, I'm also policy director of our joint initiative called The Century, which is an initiative of the Enough Project, Not on Our Watch, and an organization called C4ADS. And it's really through that lens that I'll try to pick up on where Manal left off with, is sort of what do we do from here. And the Century analysis of the 5 countries that we work on flows from much the same starting point that Alex laid out today and in his book. Politics and governance has been captured or hijacked by this marketplace, and that understanding and impacting the networks involved in that capture are the keys to effective policy and action moving forward. As the Century, we see this through a term we call violent kleptocracy, where the criminal networks running government do not simply exploit the system, but rather capture and become the system, working through layers of perpetrators, facilitators, and enablers. The kleptocratic network then relies on violence, sometimes in overt and horrific ways, but leading to atrocities, but in other cases, as Alex noted at the end of his talk, on a more limited or indirect basis, where the threat of violence looms but is not actually needed to be enacted. So from the Century perspective, we aim to pick up the story and act on it from there. We work as practitioners to try to impact the way these particular political marketplaces that are functioning as violent kleptocracies actually operate, focusing our efforts as much as possible on what Alex, in his book, lays out as the 4th variable of real politics, which is the integration back into the global marketplace. Put another way, there may be a competition within a subset of actors in these political marketplaces, but the systems as a whole function closer to monopolies, and as such will likely fail or at a minimum create disastrous consequences for their consumers. For the Century, looking at integration back into the global marketplace means the global political and the global financial marketplace, because in the end, the rents and the proceeds of what is gained in the dynamics that Alex describes in the political marketplace will almost always have to come back these days to the global financial system. Although the political entrepreneurs and operators may focus their efforts on maintaining local, national, and regional systems to maintain their kleptocratic networks, they need to move the proceeds elsewhere. And that's where the opportunity comes in if we can mobilize more effectively than we have in the past. The global political and especially the global financial marketplaces have evolved substantially in the last 10 to 15 years, at least with respect to the tools that they use to regulate themselves. Effective use of the regulatory tools in place requires 2 key steps. One is political will, direction, and understanding, much of which we can gain from Alex's book, and actionable information. The trouble is that in many cases when we speak about this particular region, those who understand the political context and political aims and policy aims do not necessarily have familiarity with the regulatory tools, and conversely, those who understand the tools generally have little to no experience in the region, meaning that little to nothing gets done other than what are often superficial steps with no follow-through, the mediator's curse that Alex refers to in his book. Our aim with the Century is to fill those gaps so that the relevant policymakers who understand the local political marketplaces know what tools to exist that can impact those marketplaces, and the market regulators know a bit more about how to effectively apply what tools we have in those situations. In terms of the first step, political will and direction, this must always be the starting point. Identification of clear foreign policy goals must define how we move forward. Within the U.S. system, there is often frustration in places like the Treasury Department and the Justice Department when the foreign policy machinery cannot agree on what we want to achieve in a particular country because we have competing ideas about who those actors are and what those actors are seeking to achieve in their political marketplaces. Alex's vignettes in his book demonstrate this very well, especially around the case of Sudan. Unfortunately, without clear political will and direction, the regulatory tools themselves become the policy, and as such will almost always fail because they are deployed to achieve something they cannot. But once we have appropriate direction and will, we can start to use the tools, provided we have what is essentially the second step, accurate and actionable information. The efforts of the century and our partners now are to develop investigative networks and data analysis tools from the ground to fill those information gaps. Transaction documents, corporate structure and beneficiary information, details from the ground about how the day-to-day activities within these marketplaces. These are what regulators need not only to deploy the tools, but then to implement and enforce them, as we have seen happen in other contexts. When I was at Treasury and the State Department, we often did not have anything like this kind of information for countries like Sudan or the DRC, for example. I know outside the Horn, but a country relevant to our work. This takes time, patience, resources, consistent and focused effort to check and recheck what you have to ensure that you can act on it and it is the most useful and actionable information. So if we can actually develop the right political will and this type of actionable information, what tools do we have to try to impact the political marketplaces, the violent kleptocracies that we focus on today? I'll list 3 or 4 very quickly, as I know I have kind of a limited amount of time. The first is modernized sanctions. Most of the discussion around sanctions when it comes to Sudan and the Horn is limited to the comprehensive form that we have in place related to Sudan, which is really a vestige of older models, or asset freezes and travel bans that are placed on certain individuals. These are both old models in what is an ever-changing marketplace when you look of sanctions tools. Individualized sanctions themselves have actually only been in place, used for about 20 years, but are now understood well enough by those that they impact that they can often be circumvented unless effective enforcement is in place, which it often is not. But we now have modernized tools for sanctions, such as sectoral sanctions, where particular elements of a marketplace can be impacted, whether through targeting a company overall, or if we don't want to target a company for an all-out asset freeze and ban, by limiting their future access to capital, by impacting their ability to receive, to benefit from procurement, to receive the benefit of U.S. exports, development bank financing, etc. We have approaches to secondary sanctions, where the U.S. system can limit access to correspondent banking accounts, take other measures to limit the access of the kleptocratic actors to the global financial system. And the sanctions tools that have been developed over the last, say, 5 to 7 years have really shown how that can be done. But again, they can only really be effective if we have clear political direction and we have actionable information. The second category I'll focus on is anti-money laundering tools. People may be familiar with the Financial Action Task Force and Egmont Group, which act at the international level to set standards and establish cooperative frameworks. But if we look at the range of tools that, say, our U.S. Financial Intelligence Unit, which is called the Financial Crimes Enforcement Network, the tools they have at their disposal through the Section 311 of the Patriot Act, the Bank Secrecy Act, give them a wide array of a very precise and surgical means to get at particular kinds of transactions. For example, Section 311 of the Patriot Act has 5 what are called special measures that can be taken. Only one of those 5 has ever been used, and even the one that has been used, only a part of it has been used. So the agency itself has barely scratched the surface of what can be done. And most of what can be done is actually simply to gather information, to require enhanced due diligence, to give law enforcement and regulators the power to understand how these networks are moving money, where they're moving network, and to more surgically try to deal with it. Okay. The Financial Crimes Enforcement Network also has the power to do something what are called geographic targeting orders, which they did recently in a very interesting way to target those who are attempting to buy real estate in New York and Miami with cash, to require those who are involved in those transactions to gather beneficial ownership information and try to impact how these transactions happen. Other kinds of tools, and I know I'm limited, direct action with the private sector because of the way sanctions are impacting banks, as well as things like the UN Guiding Principles on Business and Human Rights, conflict minerals regulation, laws in the UK and California that require due diligence around supply chains for human trafficking. The private sector is more and more willing and able to act on specific information where it has actionable information. Two final quick thoughts. All of the tools I talk about often can have a debilitating effect unless information is also used to mitigate their impact. There's often a problem of de-risking, where when an action is taken to affect a particular country, private sector or even governments will over-comply and refuse to do business in an entire region. The more we can develop actionable information, the more we can help facilitate the development of open channels so that necessary business can be conducted. And finally, with the right actionable information, we can work to, I think, build on what Alex ends his book at is the development of better governance systems. And as the push comes from below for proper systems that are properly regulated, to development of information that can show how those can be developed and enforced. I'll stop there.